Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today to learn how to create your Faces of IDF handout. This will be a wonderful tool in your personal advocacy as well as a tool for IDF's advocacy in the future. During this tutorial, you're going to learn three things. You'll learn how to concisely get your story down in writing in 3 paragraphs. I know that sounds short, but we're going to teach you how to hit on the most important points for this particular purpose. You're also going to learn about the importance of advocate stories, which is what will be included on your handout, and how you'll use this tool in your own advocacy. And we'll also teach you how IDF will use your tool for our advocacy. So let's get into creating your Faces of IDF handout. You'll see on the screen a sample that has been created by an actual member of the PI community. Sam Aiden joined us for a workshop not long ago and created this by submitting his story, and we turned it into this handout. We'll be going through each individual section throughout this tutorial, but this is what your final product will look like. To create this, you'll be using an online form that we've created specifically for this purpose. You'll see screenshots of that form on your screen now. It'll have individual sections where you'll fill in different portions of your story. We'll be going over each section in more detail, but this is the form you'll be using to submit that information as well as a picture of yourself. So what are the 3 parts of your story that will be included on your handout? They are, who are you, your journey to diagnosis, and why is maintaining access to your prescribed treatment important? Again, we'll be going through these 3 portions in significant more detail. First, who are you? It sounds simple, but we want to make sure that you hit on a few very important points to make sure that we drive home everything we need to in your one-pager. First and foremost, you want to include your name, your age, and that you're a member of the PI community and what that means. And in case you need a refresher, here's a little bit of information about primary immunodeficiency. There are more than 400 of these rare chronic disorders where the body's immune system is missing or functions improperly. They are hereditary or genetic, not contagious. These are a few buzzwords you might want to think about including, just to explain what PI is simply to someone who's never heard of this term before. Also, a little bit more information about PI. There are 250,000 diagnosed in the US, but thousands more go undetected. And there's a little bit of information there about what individuals affected with PI find difficult. And if you want to read up on these, I definitely recommend it. For when you're using this handout, it'll be a supplement to a live interaction often. And so these are pieces of information that are worthwhile to drop in those conversations. So what else do you want to include in your Who Are You section? This is where we make it personal and make it uniquely you. You want to talk about what connects you to your community. This can mean where you attend or attended school. It can be what activities you're involved in. And there are a few examples there, sports teams, youth groups, service clubs, but that certainly isn't all encompassing. This can be any activity you're involved in, theater, it could be Boy Scouts, it could be a little of anything that you're involved in your community. You also want to talk about what special interests or hobbies or talents you have. You want to make this very unique to you. And so the more facts and details that you can provide about yourself, the better. So here we have Sam's Who Are You section. Let's talk about what Sam did well here. So you can see he first up front gave his name, his age, and his hometown. He then also mentions that he's a proud member of the primary immunodeficiency community. You'll see Sam mention several of the activities he's involved in, such as speech team, band, student council, and swim team. So he's made this very personal to him. He then also talks about how PI has impacted him personally. He really personalizes this Who Are You section, and the person reading this handout will walk away from this having a much better sense of who Sam Aiden is as a person. I also want to highlight that this section that you're reading on your screen is 155 words. When you go in to fill in your Who Are You section, you'll see that the suggested word target we give you is 150 words. Mind you, that's just a target. If you don't hit it on the dot, that is okay. But just bear in mind that this section on your screen right now is 155 words. So around this length is what you're shooting for. So the next section you'll be including in your handout is your journey to diagnosis. So what does that mean? You're going to briefly talk about your journey to receiving a diagnosis and what that diagnosis means. And that entails explaining what your diagnosis is and what that means in simple terms. Remember, these handouts will be given to oftentimes people that don't have medical background and that aren't familiar with the PI community. So you're going to want to avoid acronyms and medical jargon. Spell out what your diagnosis is. For example, if you have CVID, spell out exactly what that acronym means. You also want to explain your diagnosis how you would to a child. Avoiding medical jargon, avoiding anything too complicated, explain it very simply, and touch on how it affects your everyday life. You're then also going to want to talk about when you began having medical issues, and then what led to your diagnosis and how long did it take for you to receive one. As you probably know, every member of the PI community has a very different journey to diagnosis. So this portion of your handout is again going to be very personal and very unique to you. So here's Sam's journey to diagnosis. So let's talk about what Sam does really well here. Sam talks about where his journey began. His journey began with his mother being diagnosed. And then he gets into, I had many health issues, I had many ear infections and constantly complained of not feeling well at school. Doctors noticed I was needing antibiotics much more frequently. And then he talks about, then my mom was diagnosed and my parents decided to get me tested. Sam then gets into finding out his diagnosis, which is hypogammaglobulinemia and specific antibody deficiency, or SAD for short. So what Sam does really well here is he specifically says what his diagnosis is, hypogammaglobulinemia, and specific antibody deficiency. And as you'll notice, SAD has an acronym. However, he spelled out that diagnosis very clearly and puts that acronym in parentheses. Oftentimes, people not very familiar with our community may have heard an acronym here and there. And so putting that in parentheses, maybe that would resonate with them and maybe they can find some familiarity in this story. He also then talks about how he was very fortunate to already know about PI due to his mother's journey. So that makes this very unique to Sam. Oftentimes, members of our community had never heard of primary immunodeficiency before their own diagnosis. So he explains why his journey is unique. I also want to again mention this specific section is 146 words. As I've mentioned before, the target for each of these sections is 150, but to give you an idea of length that you're shooting for, this is 146 words. So your third and final section is going to be, why is maintaining access to your prescribed treatment important? So you're going to briefly explain the treatment you're currently prescribed and how you and your doctor came to that decision. This can be many things. Perhaps you bruise easily, and so you and your doctor decided that IVIG made more sense for you. Perhaps you work from home, and it made more sense for you to do in-home treatments. There are many things that go into the decision that you make with your doctor as to what treatment works best for you, and this is where you want to talk about that. You then want to get into the importance of maintaining access to that treatment. And again, this can mean many things. This can mean maintaining affordability. This can mean continuing to be able to receive your treatments in home. This can mean maintaining insurance coverage of your particular product. It can mean many things to many different people. And this is again where you want to make this uniquely about you. So here's Sam's maintaining access section. So let's talk about what Sam did well here. So Sam, first and foremost, says what treatment he is on, intravenous immunoglobulin replacement therapy, or IVIG. Again, he's avoiding acronyms. He says exactly what IVIG means for people that aren't familiar, and then gives the acronym. Oftentimes people have heard of IVIG, but they may not know exactly what that stands for. He then says what IVIG is, which is wonderful. He makes this very accessible to people who are not familiar with our community or to our treatments at all. He says IVIG is made of antibodies collected from donated plasma and makes up for the ones I don't create myself. So very simply, he explains why he needs this treatment. He then gets into, he gets this treatment every 4 weeks. and the fact that it's changed his life very much. He then talks about without it, he wouldn't be involved in the activities he is today. And then he gets into why access is important. He says this treatment is expensive, as most people on this webinar probably are aware, and he relies on insurance to continue receiving it. Now, Sam, like many young people in our community, is currently not on his own insurance plan. And most people on today's webinar likely aren't either. And that's okay. That means that you can talk about why it's important when you are on your own insurance that you still have access to the treatment that you and your doctor have determined works best for you. And that's what Sam highlights in this section, is he doesn't want to have to choose his college or career or job to ensure that he can still maintain affordable access to his treatments. So Sam really personalized this very nicely and really hit on all the points we just talked about previously. And again, this section is 146 words. Your target is 150, so this length is about what you're going for. Now you've completed all 3 sections of your story. Now it's time to add your face to your Faces of IDF handout. You're going to want to choose a photo that is current, only contains you, and is appropriate. This is the picture that Sam chose. From what I can tell, it looks like it may be a school photo, which is a great picture of him to use. It's current, it only contains him, and it's obviously very appropriate. So once you've submitted all of these sections of your story and your picture, you'll press submit on that form that we showed you earlier, and you'll let IDF work our magic. We will be returning your handouts to you within a month of receiving them. They may have a few edits to them for length or for clarity, but for the most part, it's going to be your story that you submit to us. So now that you have your handout, how do you use that handout? Here are a few opportunities that IDF offers for grassroots advocacy. Many people in our community are familiar with our Advocacy Day. We hold this every year. This past year, we did it virtually. You may have participated in an in-person event in the past, or perhaps you participated in our virtual Advocacy Day this year, but we find these events very successful no matter how we conduct them. As you know, this Advocacy Day event is advocating to Congress for federal issues impacting the PI community. We then also have our Health Access Advocate program, and that is our policy volunteer role. And these individuals advocate for the PI community in their home state. So they're mostly working on state policy issues. We then have our state advocacy workshops. Again, this is dealing with state policy. This year, we are holding those in California, New York, and Ohio. This year, those will be entirely virtual. So if you're interested in participating in those, I definitely recommend checking those out. We also have our IDF action alerts. Most people who are watching this are probably signed up for them. These are a way that we let community members know when their action is needed to reach out to their elected representatives on federal and state issues, depending on what the issue is. And we reach out to you when we need you to make your voice heard for the PI community. We then lastly also have the advocacy playlist. This is our YouTube playlist that has videos on a variety of issues that we have worked on in the past and are currently working on in the policy space for the PI community. So what are ways that you can advocate for people with primary immunodeficiency? There are many different ways you can do this. You can share your stories and experiences with policymakers, and this handout that you're creating from this tutorial is a great way to do that. You can testify at hearings. You can work with other patient organizations on health access at issues. IDF works very collaboratively with other patient organizations in different states and at the federal level to achieve mutual goals. You can mobilize other members of the PI community. Social media is a great tool for that. You can respond to action alerts, or you can email, write, and phone officials and urge leaders to take actions on issues affecting the PI community. So we talked about the ways that you can get involved. How do you use your handout in that advocacy? Some ways you can do this are you can send that handout directly to your elected representatives as a PDF and an email to introduce yourself as a constituent. Creating relationships with those that represent you is so important, and this is a great first step to do that. It also provides a really easy way to introduce yourself, as all of the important points of your story are right there in writing. You can also attach your new handout as a PDF to emails requesting a meeting or conference call with your elected representatives. This is a great attachment to always include in correspondence with your elected representatives, but it's especially important when you're requesting a meeting because it gives them an idea of exactly who they're going to be either sitting across the table from or sitting on the phone with. It very easily puts a face to your name. You're also going to want to include this with submitted testimony. As I mentioned previously, one way that you can advocate for members of the PI community is to testify at hearings. And when you do that, you're going to be submitting a written copy of your testimony oftentimes. Including this handout with that written testimony is a great way to, again, put a face with a name. They're going to see that written testimony, but being able to have your story attached to it as well really makes that testimony much more personal, especially for members that are going to be reading after the hearing. Lastly, you can also bring hard copies to events where you may be interacting with elected representatives, such as town hall meetings, IDF Advocacy Day, the state advocacy workshops we discussed earlier, and other events. Of course, these are going to look very different during the COVID-19 pandemic. Events where you could be interacting with elected representatives aren't happening right now, but in the future, this will be a wonderful tool for situations like that. One important thing to remember is that your handout is a supplement to sharing your story live. Of course, this touches on the main points of your story, but it's not the entire story. You should provide more detail when you're sharing your story live, either in person or on the phone. You can reference your handout when you're sharing more details in your story, but I would definitely recommend giving more information when you're speaking with them personally. Again, this handout will also serve as a refresher after your meeting or your call or your testimony of exactly who you were and what that story was. Your voice matters. Why is it so important for you to create this tool and to be able to utilize it? You have a tool that lobbyists don't. You have a real personal story. Public policy staff for IDF can go into a congressman's office and tell them how a bill will impact members of the PI community. But what is so much more impactful for them is to actually hear it from members of the PI community. Those personal stories are what really create a wonderful rapport with elected representatives and really drive home how policies will impact your community. Just by reaching out to them, these elected representatives can see that you have value and concerns that have to be addressed. Especially when you're reaching out to them live, you can't be ignored. They have to respond to your concerns then and there. Also, personal connections help members consider issues they may not have been aware of before. Oftentimes, members of the PI community come back from Advocacy Day and say, I met with this congressman. He had never even heard of IVIG or SCIG. He didn't know about the barriers we face in accessing it affordably. Oftentimes, you're going to be presenting issues to them they may have never considered before or even knew existed. And also, as a constituent and a voter, legislators have a vested interest in addressing your concerns. You vote for them. You are the most important person in that room when you are meeting with elected representatives, and that's important to remember. So, advocacy during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the tagline we used for our virtual Advocacy Day this year. You can't walk the halls, but you can make the calls. So what does that mean? It means that a lot of meetings you may be conducting with elected representatives in the near future are going to be virtual. They're going to be tele-meetings. So that can be intimidating. Sitting across the table from a congressman and sitting on the other end of the line from a congressman are two very different feelings. So here are some tips to conducting a successful telemeeting. Introductions are so important. Introductions are important in in-person meetings as well. However, when you can't see the person you're talking to, ensuring that you know the names of who you're speaking with are very important, and making sure that they know who you are is just as important as well. You're going to want to succinctly describe the issue that you're discussing with them. Again, being on the phone with someone makes clarity so much more important. You can't play off of their reactions, and so you aren't going to be able to see if they are nodding in agreement because they understand what you're saying. So you're going to want to make sure that you're describing the issue that you're there to talk to them about very clearly and very succinctly. You're going to want to share a concise, poignant personal story linked to that issue. This is where you reference your Faces of IDF handout that you sent over before the meeting. Again, you're going to be conducting this over the phone, which means that you're going to want to reference that in their email and make sure that they receive that, and make sure that you highlight the things that you're talking about that are in that handout that you're describing in more detail. You're also going to want to make sure that you are very clearly asking for what you want that legislator to do. It may very well be that this call is simply to introduce yourself as a constituent, and maybe you don't have an ask. But if you are there to make an ask, support a piece of legislation, oppose a piece of legislation, you're going to want to make sure that you very clearly ask that. Also, if someone asks you a question you don't know an answer to, that's okay. I always tell our advocates, you're not there to be an expert in policy. You're there to be an expert in your story, and who's a better expert in you than you. If you get asked a detailed question about a piece of legislation or about a stat about the PI community and you don't know the answer to that, that is okay. Simply tell them you aren't sure, but you'll have IDF get back to them with that information. And be sure you let us know that we need to follow up with them. We will always provide follow-up material, but you have to let us know that we need to do that. Lastly, be sure you offer IDF as a resource. As I mentioned, you're there to be an expert in your story. We're there to be the experts in the stats and the policy, etc. So feel free to offer IDF as a resource. Give them our contact information. We're always happy to serve as a resource for any legislator. And finally, you're going to want to say thank you. These are crazy times, as you know, and someone taking the time to meet with you, no matter the reason, is really important, and we want to make sure that they know that we really appreciate that. Questions that can help you engage the person you're on the phone with. As I mentioned, it's very intimidating getting on a telephone meeting with an elected representative or a member of their staff. So what are some questions that you can help engage them if, say, you're on the phone and the conversation kind of dies down and it's a little awkward? Here are some questions to help engage. Are you familiar with primary immunodeficiency? This is a really easy open door question that leads into you explaining what that means, and then it can lead into you explaining what specific diagnosis you have and what that means for your daily life. You then can ask, are you familiar with immunoglobulin therapy? Again, this is a great open door question that can lead into you explaining exactly what immunoglobulin is. You can get into exactly what treatment you're on, and then you can explain why access to that particular treatment is important. And if that relates to the issue that you're there to discuss with that elected representative, this is a great way to tie all of that in. Lastly, you always want to ask, what questions can I answer for you? Oftentimes, people that you're going to be meeting with have never heard of primary immunodeficiency or immunoglobulin therapy, and they're probably going to have some questions. So this is a great question for you to ask them to allow them to ask any questions that they aren't sure how to ask. Lastly, after you've met with whomever you've met with, you're going to want to make sure that you follow up with a thank you. Thank you notes are not only polite, they also allow you to present your ask again and keeps IDF and our issues on their mind. Again, you may simply be meeting with someone to introduce them to yourself as a constituent and introduce them to the PI community. But if you do have an ask, again, something like supporting a piece of legislation, this is a great way to put it back on their radar. You're going to want to thank your legislator in writing and attach your Faces of IDF handout to that email. As we mentioned before, that handout is meant to be a refresher of who you are and your story. It doesn't include every detail that you guys would have talked about, but it's going to be a great refresher of who they spoke with. You're also going to want to, again, remind your legislator of the issue if there was one that you were reaching out to them about. You're going to want to add a key fact to remind them of your meeting. For example, say you both realize that you attend the same church or attended the same high school. something like that. Be sure to include a key fact. If you would like to include a stat, if you talked about IVIG use in the PI community and you would like to include a key fact about IVIG use and the percentage of our community that utilizes that, reach out and we can provide that if that's something that you would like to include in your follow-up. Include links with additional information if available. We have a lot of resources on our website that relate to a wide array of policy issues. We also have a lot of videos that very simply explain policy issues that impact our PI community. Feel free to browse our website and see if there's a link that can be useful to include in that email. Again, make your request for action again. If you wanted them to support a piece of legislation, end your email with something that asks that, such as, please be sure to support AB 2199 for members of the PI community like myself, something along those lines. So you're conducting all this outreach and you're meeting with elected representatives. You're going to want to let everyone know that you're doing that. You're going to want to let the PI community know that you are advocating for them. So be sure that you share your experiences on our social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And as I mentioned before, and as most people on this webinar probably already are, be sure you're signed up for IDF action alerts. Here are the steps to do that if you haven't already, but I definitely recommend it. This is the quickest way for IDF to reach out to you when there is an issue that we need you to make your voice heard on. So lastly, how will IDF share your story or your handout that you've created? First and foremost, IDF and our representatives will only use Faces of IDF handouts of those who have authorized us to do so. You will not be surprised of seeing your handout on a congressman's desk one day when you walk in for a meeting, not knowing that that was going to happen. We will always get authorization before we use any of these handouts. So, say you've given us authorization. Who might wind up distributing your Faces of IDF handout? These are IDF staff, health access advocates, or IDF volunteers advocating for the PI community. Who may receive or see your Faces of IDF handout? This is a little bit longer list. Congress, agency representatives, such as Health and Human Services or health departments in various states, state legislators, local elected representatives, think City Council, and IDF social media subscribers. So we've covered what's going to go in your handout, how to create that, which is submit your information to us and we'll turn that into your handout to be returned within a month. We've gone over how to use that new tool in your advocacy, and we've gone over how IDF may share your new handout. So if you still have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I'm Jamie Sexton, and you can see my contact information there on the screen, as well as Lynn Albizo's, IDF's Vice President of Public Policy. Feel free to reach out to either of us. We are more than happy to be a resource to you as you are completing your story in this process. We're looking forward to turning your submission into your new advocacy tool for use in the future. Thank you so much for joining us.